Now let's take a look at how to create term bases. And when thinking about how to create term bases, there's two methods that we can follow to do so. We can create a term base from a template, and we can create a term base from scratch. So let's take a look at how to do those two things. So as you might imagine, to create a new term base, we want to click the Create Term Base button within the Home menu of that top navigational ribbon. Now, when I hit that button, Create Term Base, the first thing that MultiTerm is going to do is it's going to prompt me to save the term base, to give the term base a name and to save the file. So I'm going to give this term base the name MultiTerm Tutorial TB from template. Once I save my term base, that's going to take me to the term base wizard in MultiTerm. The first thing that MultiTerm will prompt me to do is to state whether I'm going to define the definition or the structure of my term base from scratch, or if I'm going to use a predefined template. I'm going to use a predefined template this time, selecting bilingual glossary from the list that also contains options like multilingual term base. And then I'm going to go to the next page, give my term base a friendly name. This is the name that's going to appear in the term bases lists within the MultiTerm application. And then I can just keep moving through the wizard from there. I'm going to remove the default languages that have been selected for my template. I'd like to add some variants of languages to the languages of my term base, so I'm going to click Show Sublanguages, and then I'll just go and select the languages that I would like to have in my term base. In this case, I'm going to add English for the United States, and I will add as well Spanish for Mexico. On the next page, the term base wizard asks me if I would like to add any descriptive fields to the list of the descriptive fields that are already contained within the term base for the template. Descriptive field is a synonym for data category. Descriptive field is the label that MultiTerm uses for a data category. Because I'm working with a template here, I'm just going to go with the predefined list. I'm also going to go with the predefined structure. It's a template, right? Might as well follow the template. And so on the next page, I just need to click Finish, and I will have created a new term base within MultiTerm. So I clicked Finish, and now that term base that I just created appears in the list, MT Tutorial TB from templates, of the term bases that I have open within the application. Okay, so next let's take a look at creating a term base from scratch, not based upon a template. Okay, so I followed those same steps again to get back to the term base wizard within MultiTerm. That is, I clicked Create Term Base from the Home menu and gave my term base a name. This time I'm going to create a new term base definition from scratch. I'm going to give my term base a friendly name. Once again, I've gone ahead and added some languages to my term base. And now this is the fun part. This is where we get to define our descriptive fields. So for the purposes of this term base and this tutorial, I'm just going to create a very simple term base structure where the descriptive fields that I'm going to add are just a few. I'm just going to add 4. And to add a descriptive field, as you can see, what I've been doing is I've been putting the name for the descriptive field into the field label and then clicking Add. Once I have those descriptive field labels in the list of descriptive fields to include in my term base, I can do some additional configuration. For example, I can set my field to a pick list if I want to have more structure and control in the way that people are entering terminological data into my term base, if I use something like a pick list, that can help later on to ensure that when I'm doing filtering, everyone has followed a consistent approach to defining this particular data category within the concept entry. I'm using the subject fields in this case from the LocTerms glossary. I can select keep history or not. And so now my subject descriptive field is set up as a pick list, and I can go through and do that same action for any other of the data categories that I'm going to include in my term base as well. Okay, so I've got my descriptive fields ready, and now I'm going to go to the entry structure, where what I'm wanting to define here is what data categories, what fields are going to go at what level of the term base. Just because I know it's a best practice, I'm going to include note at every single level of my term base. So I will add data categories to a level of the entry structure by clicking the entry structure label and then highlighting the data categories I'd like to add to that level. At the language level, I'm just going to add a note at the term level. And I can also go through and do some rearranging. If I wanted the note to be first, I could do that. I actually don't want the note to be first. I would like to have the term type followed by term status and then note. When I'm going through and setting up this aspect of my structure, I can also define whether a field is mandatory. Like maybe I want to make the subject field mandatory, since it's a best practice to have a subject field associated with concept entries. I'm not actually going to do that, because if I mark the field as mandatory, the entry cannot be created unless that mandatory field has been filled out. If I select multiple, that means that I could add multiple notes to an entry. I could add multiple subjects to an entry. So for my term type and term status, I don't need those to be multiple. And so I will deselect that radio button there. All right, I'm ready to finish up with my term base creation. And now that I've done so, you can see that that new term base I created from scratch appears in my list. All right, so a couple last pieces of advice that I would like to give on creating term bases within MultiTerm, or indeed within any terminology management application or CAT tool with a terminology management module. When you get to define the definition or the structure of your term base, and that is that you first of all don't want to add term and language data categories to your term base. You may have noticed that I didn't add those things either when working with the template definition in MultiTerm or when defining my own definition from scratch within MultiTerm. I did not add a data category for language to be placed at the language level, and I did not add a data category for term to be placed at the term level. This is because the system is going to create space for this information automatically. It's going to create space for these fields automatically. And in fact, if I go ahead and add my own data categories for language and term, and then I nest them into the structure of the term base at the language and term levels respectively, what's going to happen is I'm going to, first of all, have duplicate data categories, and second, I'm going to run the risk that when that term base gets applied in translation or in monolingual content authoring, any terminological data that's been collected into the data categories that I created, not the ones that the system created, are not going to prompt the CAT tool or the content authoring system to pull results from the term base for that term. So don't do that. Don't add a term data category at the term level. Don't add a language data category at the language level. The second piece of advice that I'd like to give is to be aware that specifically within MultiTerm, once you start adding terms to your term base, there are certain aspects of your structure, of your definitions that you're not going to be able to change. If you've designed your term base in compliance with ISO 30042, you can go back to your term base structure and add new data categories later on. But once you've started adding concepts and adding terms to your term base, if you discover that a specific field that you've added isn't working the way that you need it to work, if you've already got terms in the term base, there's a chance that you won't be able to edit that field. You won't be able to change it and update it to the configuration that you want, and you'll need to make the decision of whether you'll start over from scratch creating a new term base, or if you'll just sort of be satisfied with a structure that's not quite performing according to your use case and according to your needs. This is why it's always important to follow the advice that when you're getting started with a term base, you start small. You want to add maybe 5 or 10 terms to your term base, 5 or 10 concept entries to your term base when you're getting started, so you can test out how it works, so that if you discover that there's an aspect of the term base that isn't functioning as it needs to, you're not creating a whole bunch of rework for yourself when you go in and create a new term base. You're just taking that to be part of the process. And it's very normal to discover that things need slight updates when you're getting started creating term bases. So I hope these last pieces of advice help